Welcome to Heart, Soul, Mind, and Strength, where we work toward loving God with everything that makes us human. Today, we're going to take a look at whether or not all sins are equal, and we'll take a look at the Bible to answer this age-old question. Let's get into it. There are a number of theological questions that have been bandied about for years. One of those is whether or not all sins are equal, or if one sin could be more egregious than another. Perhaps for everyday people like you and me, the more important question is, who cares? I mean, do these things actually have any practical value in our lives? The short answer to that question is yes. I think there is practical value for you and for me. How we view sin affects how we deal with things like guilt or justice or forgiveness. But before we get into that and spoil which side I come down on, let's take a look at the biblical evidence. So we'll start with the argument in favor of all sin being equal. One of the first passages that comes to mind to support this idea is from James 2:10. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of all of it. Now this one seems pretty straightforward, but that's not all. Let's couple that with what Jesus talked about in his famous sermon from the Gospel of Matthew. So we'll start with Matthew 5:21-22. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. And then we move on to verses 27-28. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. From Jesus' own mouth, we get to hear that being angry with someone is tantamount to murder, and lusting after a woman is essentially no different from actually sleeping with her. And there's also the fact that the solution to the sin problem is not something that's a matter of degree. It was the same sacrifice of Jesus that reconciled all sinners and made them righteous. If you look at Romans 5:19, for just as through the disobedience of the one man the many were made sinners, so also through the obedience of the one man many will be made righteous. So let's just kind of summarize the points that we've looked at so far. Number one, failing to uphold one law makes us guilty of breaking all the law. 2, there's no essential difference between being angry and committing murder. 3, there's no essential difference between lust and committing adultery. And 4, the same price was paid regardless of the sin. So far, the case for all sin being equal looks fairly strong. But before we come to any conclusions, let's take a look at the other side. There's one glaring issue with what we've seen so far. That issue is, in order to better understand any given Bible passage, like the one from James 2:10, for example, we need to take a page from Greg Koukl of Stand to Reason and, quote, never read a Bible verse. Did he really say that? Yes, he did. But notice what he did not say. He didn't say, never read the Bible. His point is, in order to understand a particular passage of Scripture, especially a single verse, you have to read it within its surrounding context and not just pull a single verse out and make it stand on its own. So to that end, let's take a broader look at James 2. We're going to look from verse 8-13. If you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. For he who said, you shall not commit adultery, also said, you shall not murder. If you do not commit adultery but do commit murder, you have become a lawbreaker. Now, in this fuller context, now we can see that James is using a somewhat different metric. He's referring to sin in a pass-fail sort of way. You're either a lawbreaker or you're not a lawbreaker. He doesn't really address the question of the degree to which one sin might be worse than another sin. Now, what should we do with the passages from Matthew 5 then? I mean, clearly Jesus seems to be saying that anger equals murder and lust equals adultery. Doesn't that still make all sin the same? Well, no, not really. For this, I will refer you to a fantastic article written by Clay Jones in which he poses a very interesting question. Why do gangbangers stop at red lights? Now, that may seem like a completely irrelevant question, but I think it gets to the heart of what Jesus is saying in the two passages from Matthew that we looked at. See, when we're full of rage against someone, what's ultimately stopping us from murdering them? I'm not talking about just being annoyed or, kind of miffed with somebody. I mean that heavy breathing, red-eyed, high blood pressure, fist clenched, would turn into the Hulk if you were exposed to gamma radiation sort of rage. Now, we might try to pass off our lack of homicidal actions by saying, well, I'm not going to actually kill someone just because I'm angry. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, sure, there are some cultural, not to mention some legal stigmas about that sort of thing, but just imagine for a moment that we didn't have those in place. Imagine we were living in a completely anarchical society. Or maybe just imagine we're living in a real-life version of the Purge movie. You could do whatever you wanted and there would be no legal consequences. Do you really think there wouldn't be more people who took their anger to the level of actually killing someone if they were in that situation? What Jesus was getting at was that basically that when you're that angry at someone, the only reason you're probably not going to kill them is because there would be negative consequences for you. You're more motivated by self-interest than anything else. Again, this might be difficult to wrap our minds around because we're so culturally indoctrinated to the idea that murder is wrong that we're kept in line, and it's difficult to imagine how we might behave if there really were nothing holding us back. It might be a bit easier to grasp the second passage we looked at when Jesus equated lust with actual adultery. There are no laws against adultery, so although there is some social stigma, but people do it all the time. Now, again, Jesus is getting at the idea that our thoughts and beliefs inform our behaviors. We don't just stumble into bed with someone other than our spouse. That's preceded by thoughts of lust. If we're looking at someone lustfully, we've already decided that we want to sleep with them. The biggest thing holding us back is typically that we don't want to experience the consequences of getting caught. We know what we stand to lose if we follow through with it. Again, we act, or don't act, out of self-interest. So, Jesus isn't saying that anger is as grievous a sin as actual murder, or that lust is just as bad as actually committing adultery. What he's getting at is that these are heart conditions that we have to deal with. And if we fail to deal with them, they'll continue to plague us, and in some cases, they'll eventually lead us to act on them, because Jesus understands that thoughts and beliefs inform our behavior. Remember, this is the same guy who told us in Luke 6:45, the good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of the evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So if anger or lust is in our heart, we have to resolve those issues so they won't influence us to further sin. Just read through the Gospels and note how often Jesus addresses our thoughts and desires. Jesus keeps pointing back to the heart. Our thoughts shape our actions, and if unchecked, our desires will end up leading us to sin. In fact, James addresses this in his letter in chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. So, everything starts with what's in our hearts. That's why we have to guard our hearts, Proverbs 4:23. And the prophet Jeremiah also warned us that the heart is desperately wicked in chapter 17, verse 9. Now, the last thing I wanted to point out with regard to understanding Bible passages is something that a lot of scholars and pastors will often reference, and that's the idea of allowing Scripture to interpret Scripture. So, what does this look like in practice? Well, we've already covered the fact that the passages from James and Matthew could be interpreted to say either of two different things. Yes, they do become more clear when you read the context, but there may be times when even the broader context doesn't quite clear things up for you. So in those cases, a good practice is to look for other passages in the Bible that may help us to eliminate some of the false options. It's kind of like taking a multiple choice test and then just quickly eliminating the options you already know are wrong. And that way you have a higher percentage chance of guessing correctly with fewer options left. So how does this work? Well, in this case, we can look for any passages that seem to indicate that maybe sin is not all equally bad. For example, let's take a look at the latter half of John 19:11. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. Well, it certainly seems clear that Jesus is explicitly taking a side on the matter. It's a bit more difficult to take a passage like this and twist it to fit the all sin is equal narrative because there's less ambiguity. Or how about these two? Matthew 11:22. But I tell you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. Or Luke 12:47. And that servant who knew his master's will but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. Now, both of these passages seem to quite clearly indicate that the punishment for one is less than the punishment for another. Now, certainly, it wouldn't be very just for God to punish one sin more severely than another if they're qualitatively the same. So while the passages we looked at earlier could be interpreted either way, these ones don't seem to leave that same flexibility. So, with these few passages, we can eliminate some of the options for how to interpret the first few passages we looked at. Clearly, if all these passages are true, and I contend that they are, I'm sure we'll get more into that eventually, then we simply can't come to the conclusion that all sin is equally bad. So, to kind of wrap this up, I think what we've seen is that some sins seem to be worse than others and deserving of different levels of punishment, but all sin makes us lawbreakers. So, getting back to our original question, are all sins equal? No. And yes. I'm glad we cleared that up. Thanks for listening to Heart, Soul, Mind, and Strength. I hope this was helpful and maybe a little thought-provoking for you. Please stop by the website, put in your email so you get any new content. And I'm often adding more content to the resource page, so make sure you get to the site regularly. You'll find a link to the website in the show notes. Finally, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and just about any other podcast player. So make sure to like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, and tell all your friends about it. Until next time.